Hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you for joining me for this series on Jewish spirituality. So I want to share with you that I heard an amazing story this week about something called One Small Step. After the 2016 election, a radio journalist and producer by the name of Dave Icey had an idea. Now Dave, you may have heard of him before. He's actually the founder of something called StoryCorps, that placed a recording booth in Grand Central Terminal in New York City. And over the last 15 years or so, regular people have been able to come into this recording booth and talk to each other and have conversation and ask questions and share the stories of their lives. And this collection of StoryCorps actually is the largest collection of recorded human voices in all of human history. There are about 60,000 hours of interviews recorded with the Library of Congress now. This project has grown so big. But after 2016, Dave had an idea to bring together strangers, and more than strangers, people who disagreed with each other, people from opposite sides of the political aisle. Dave knew from his StoryCorps experience that sitting face to face with someone and talking with them and listening and asking questions creates a human bond, creates a connection. And so talking, this kind of sitting face to face and sharing stories, and more importantly, even listening, was his response to the hostility and the divisiveness that he was finding and that we've all been finding in our country after that election. And over the past 4 years, this project came to be called One Small Step, attempt to bridge the divide between people, one conversation at a time. The One Small Step conversation that I happened to hear about was between a Muslim woman named Amina and a homeschooled Southerner named Joseph. And they found themselves across from each other at a political rally in Austin, Texas. Joseph was wearing a MAGA hat and holding a sign that said, "Proud to be a deplorable." And Amina was across the way, peacefully protesting President Trump. But at one point, someone in the crowd knocks Dave's hat off of his head. And without thinking, Amina jumps into the fray and gets Dave's hat back for him. Because she wears a hijab, Amina said she had been picked on for dressing differently ever since she came to the U.S. as a middle schooler. It was not a good age to stand out and be different. And so seeing Joe's hat flicked off his head triggered something for Amina, and it didn't matter that Joe was a political opponent. She just had to do something. And that intervention, that small but very meaningful moment of empathy, led the two of them to a recording booth, to being part of One Small Step. Their conversation is really interesting and eye-opening. And they both say that they literally are not the same people that they were before they had this conversation with each other. They were able to listen and talk and share their experiences, and it's really quite an inspiring exchange. And so I bring this all up because you know what's going on in our world. It's November 2020. It's an election year, and of course we can't avoid the reality that whoever wins on November 3rd or 10th, or however long it takes to settle this controversial election, there will be a big chunk of our country, our neighbors and our friends and our family members, a large number of people are going to feel disappointed, maybe even disenfranchised. People will feel alienated and angry and possibly quite afraid. And that is not a good formula for peaceful coexistence and for community and for a unified future. So I wanted to share something that comes up in our Torah around this time of year when we're reading from the book of Genesis, these foundational stories of our history and of our people and of our faith. And there's this narrative that comes at the end of Parshat Noach about the Tower of Babel. And so after humanity is destroyed in the flood of Noah's generation, another tragedy occurs. people come together to build this tower to reach up to heaven. Now, I've always wondered what was so bad, what was so sinful about this building project. I kind of always thought it was a good sign that people came together to work towards a common goal, even if it was maybe something a bit arrogant, reaching up towards heaven to be close to God. But just this idea that they were coming together and working together never really seemed like anything that terrible or that sinful. But the Torah tells us that it was in fact sinful, the tower is destroyed, and humanity is never allowed to speak the same language again. And so it has this very extreme consequence for this act of building this tower. So I learned from a rabbi and teacher in Israel by the name of Dr. Ari Ackerman at the Schechter Institute, and he shared a really beautiful commentary on this text by the 19th century scholar Rabbi Yehuda Berlin, also known as the Netziv. And Rabbi Berlin argues that the sin of this generation was not that they built a tower or that they dared to try to reach up towards God. The sin was actually this idea of conformity. The tower was actually meant, the Netziv says, to look down on civilization and enforce the law that everyone should behave the same. They were looking down to make sure that people were speaking exactly the same and behaving exactly in the same ways. If they weren't in conformity, if they weren't conforming to whatever the norms the leaders said, then there was a violent kind of coercion that would take place. And that was the sin. That's why the tower had to be destroyed and why humanity had to be dispersed. The message from the Tower of Babel we can see is that diversity is a blessing, that we don't need to be afraid of different voices and opinions. We have more to fear from conformity than we do from disagreement. And so even though it's very challenging, I do find this to be a relevant message and an inspiring message for us in this day and age. There are many voices that we disagree with. There are painful and sometimes violent and dangerous distortions of words and facts in our world today. And yet we cannot survive with forced conformity. Jewish tradition and our texts and our laws and our very ritual practices are built on heated debates and long-standing disagreements between different factions from our history. But Judaism has been able, through these centuries, to model a kind of civility and respectful dissent that our American political system would do well to learn from. We have found ways in Judaism, imperfect and often with frustration, but we have found ways to disagree without completely cutting ties. We have found ways like this One Small Step project to continue talking and sharing our tradition, even with those with whom we have profound differences and disagreements. And so, friends, as we make our way through this challenging and painful and sometimes very frustrating and upsetting time, this election month and the months ahead, I will be keeping in mind that our tradition teaches that conformity is the sin. We all benefit from diverse opinions. We all benefit and grow more from conversations and voices that are different from our own, more than from sitting still in our own echo chambers. So I hope that we can move forward together in respect and in community and in hope that listening and being together, even with those who are different, brings many blessings to our world. Thank you so much.